Before the world knew his name, before the screen lit up with the roar of the crowd and the sweat-soaked grit of Rocky, Sylvester Stallone was just a man struggling to survive in the shadows of rejection. He wasn't a star, he wasn't a millionaire, he wasn't even considered a real actor by most casting directors. He was just another name at the bottom of the list, another face in the crowd of dreamers chasing the impossible in Hollywood. But what made Stallone different wasn't talent alone. It was hunger. It was obsession. It was an iron will forged in the fire of failure. Stallone was born with a partially paralyzed face, a result of birth complications that slurred his speech and gave him that unmistakable droop in his mouth. It would eventually become iconic, but in the beginning, it was just another reason people told him he'd never make it. He was bullied, misunderstood, and told he'd never belong. But deep inside, even as a young boy, he carried something most people didn't: a spark, a stubborn belief that he could be something more than the world told him he was. When he arrived in New York City to pursue acting, he had nothing. No fame, no fortune, just a burning desire and a dream that refused to die. He auditioned for over 1,000 roles and was rejected from nearly all of them, not because he couldn't act, but because he didn't fit the mold. They said his speech was off, his face too odd, his presence too intense. They laughed him out of rooms. They slammed doors in his face. At one point he was so broke he had to sell his wife's jewelry just to stay afloat. He was evicted from his apartment and lived for days in a bus terminal, cold and alone, with nothing but a script in his bag and a dream in his chest. And then, it got worse. There was a day that broke him, a day when he stood outside a liquor store, holding a sign, trying to sell his beloved dog, his only companion, for $50. Not because he wanted to, but because he couldn't afford to feed him. That moment wasn't just painful, it was humiliating. But that's what the world doesn't see. It doesn't see the tears behind the grit. It doesn't see the man behind the myth. Before Stallone became a legend, he was a man who had hit rock bottom and still chose to get up. And yet, in the middle of that storm, came a spark. One night watching a Muhammad Ali fight on TV, inspiration struck. A new kind of character was born in Stallone's mind, not a polished, perfect hero, but a raw, broken, underdog fighter who could take a beating and still keep moving forward. That night, Stallone sat down and began to write Rocky. He wrote for 3 straight days, fueled by desperation and fire. He poured everything into it, his pain, his failures, his fight. This wasn't just a script, it was his soul in ink. But the fight wasn't over. When he finally pitched Rocky, studios were interested. They liked the script. They offered hundreds of thousands of dollars for it. But there was one condition: Stallone couldn't star in it. They wanted a real actor, a known face, someone marketable. Stallone was broke, homeless, starving, and they were dangling the kind of money that could have changed his life overnight. But he said no, over and over, because he knew Rocky wasn't just a story, it was his story. If he gave it away, he'd be selling his soul. He turned down $125,000, then $250,000, then $350,000, and they thought he was insane. But Stallone stood firm, and finally, United Artists caved. They gave him a shot, a tiny budget, a risky role, but a shot. And that's all he ever needed. The rest, history. Rocky was released in 1976 and became a global phenomenon. It was nominated for 10 Academy Awards, won Best Picture, and transformed Stallone into a household name. The man they said could never act became the face of one of the most iconic films in history. The man who had sold his dog for food bought him back and walked onto the red carpet with the world watching. But this chapter isn't about fame. It's not about the Oscars. It's about the man who endured when he had every reason to quit. The man who refused to sell his dream, even when it cost him everything. Stallone wasn't born a legend. He became one through pain, sacrifice, and unshakable belief. He was laughed at, rejected, dismissed, but he never gave up. And that is why his story still echoes across generations, because he didn't wait for someone to believe in him. He believed in himself when no one else would. That's where real greatness begins, not with applause, but with resistance. Not with comfort, but with pain. Stallone's rise wasn't a miracle. It was a battle, and in that battle he showed the world what it means to be unbreakable. Success didn't make Sylvester Stallone soft, it made him sharper. Because behind the Oscar-winning film, behind the millions at the box office, and behind the red carpets and flashing cameras, was still the same man who had slept in a bus terminal and sold his dog to survive. The pain never left him, it just transformed. It turned into purpose, and that purpose didn't fade after one hit. In fact, it only grew stronger, because Stallone knew that Rocky was never just about a boxer, it was about every person who's ever been counted out, and so, he trained not only to play a fighter but to live like one. While Hollywood praised his underdog breakthrough, Stallone doubled down. He dove into training with the same obsession that drove him to write the script. He didn't just want to act, he wanted to embody the grit, sweat, and agony of real fighters. He trained like a champion, pushing his body to its limits, not because anyone demanded it, but because that's who he was. This was his code. If you're going to do something, do it like your life depends on it. For him, it did. His entire identity was tied to his will to outwork the world. Discipline was legendary. While others partied, he prepared. While others settled into success, he treated every day like he still had nothing to lose. He wasn't chasing fame, he was chasing legacy. He knew that what made Rocky powerful wasn't the victory at the end, it was the beating he took along the way and still kept standing. So Stallone lived that message. His body was his temple, his work ethic, his religion, and in a world addicted to shortcuts, he chose the long, painful road. Again, he trained with boxers, studied fight footage, put himself through grueling workouts sometimes, multiple times a day just to capture the authenticity of the fighter spirit. He rewrote his own physical limits. His workouts weren't about vanity, they were about identity. They were about becoming the man who refused to be broken. Every drop of sweat, every aching joint, every bruisette all reminded him that he was alive, that he was still hungry, that he hadn't arrived, not yet, not ever, even after Rocky's success. He wasn't safe from failure. Some of his projects bombed. Critics trashed his work. People questioned if he was a one-hit wonder, but he didn't flinch. He took the hits. Because a fighter doesn't win every round, but he stays in the ring. Stallone kept creating, kept writing, kept building. He went on to create Rambo, another cultural icon, another embodiment of pain, perseverance, and raw strength. And just like Rocky, Rambo wasn't just a movie, it was a message. When the world pushes you down, you push back harder. He understood that life itself is a fight. And to survive, you can't be passive. You can't wait for the perfect moment. You have to be willing to step into the ring every single day. Some days you'll win, some days you'll bleed. But if you keep showing up, if you keep throwing punches, life eventually respects your persistence. Stallone didn't rely on motivation, he built habits. He didn't talk about goals, he lived them, and that's what made him different. That's what made him unforgettable. But what made Stallone truly inspiring wasn't just his work ethic, it was his obsession. He didn't just want to be great, he needed to be. He once said, "I take rejection as someone blowing a bugle in my ear to wake me up and get going, rather than retreat." That mindset of turning every no into fuel became the foundation of his rise. Every rejection became a rep. Every failure, a set. Every setback, a spark. He wasn't just building a career, he was forging a mentality. The fighter mentality isn't about winning every battle, it's about refusing to stay down. It's about waking up sore, defeated, exhausted and still showing up. It's about putting everything you have into something when no one is watching, when no one believes, when no one claps. And that's what Stallone mastered. That's what separated him from every other actor chasing the spotlight. He didn't perform for applause. He performed because his soul demanded it. And the deeper truth is this: Stallone's real fight was never in the boxing ring. It was in life. It was against the odds, against rejection, against being told he wasn't enough. And instead of folding, he fought. That's why millions still connect with Rocky. Not because it's about boxing, but because it's about life punching you in the face, and you refusing to stay down. It's about heart, hunger, discipline, and grit. So when you see Stallone lifting weights past midnight, when you see him rewriting scenes until dawn, when you hear stories of him performing his own stunts and pushing through injuries, it's not for show. It's who he is. A man who never gave up. A man who built his identity not on talent, but on sheer will. A fighter in every sense of the word. And that's what the world remembers. Not just the movies, not just the muscles, but the message. That when life laughs at you, when it hits you, when it knocks you to your knees, you fight, you rise, you endure. That is the fighter mentality. And Sylvester Stallone didn't just act it, he lived it. Even icons fall, even the strongest fighters get knocked down. And for Sylvester Stallone, the fall wasn't just a stumble, it was a slide into a decade of doubt, ridicule, and fading relevance. The man who once stood atop the world as the face of American grit, strength, and defiance began to feel the weight of Hollywood's cruelest curse, being forgotten. In the late 90s and early 2000s, his films began to flop. The magic that once drew millions to theaters seemed to fade. New stars were rising, and critics were sharpening their knives. eager to declare that Stallone's best days were behind him. He was mocked for being too old, too outdated, too one-dimensional, and just like that, the world that once applauded him began to whisper, "He's done." For most people, that's where the story would end. They would retreat, they would cash out and disappear into comfort, haunted by their former glory, but not Stallone, because underneath the fame, the muscles, the iconic roles, he was still the same man who had once slept in a bus terminal, the same man who had been told no 1,000 times and kept writing, the same man who had built his legend on pain, sacrifice, and relentless fire. That man wasn't finished. He was wounded, but he wasn't done, and so began the climb. Again, what most didn't see during Stallone's quiet years was the work, the behind-the-scenes grind, the hours he spent training alone in empty gyms, still keeping the discipline alive, the pages he filled with scripts that would never be made, the mental battles he fought in the silence of irrelevance. That kind of fall doesn't just hurt the career, it shakes the soul. But Stallone knew something most people forget. Legacy is not built when you're on top, it's tested when you fall. It would have been easy to give in, to accept that he'd already made his mark, to become a memory. But that was never who he was. Instead, Stallone did what he'd always done. He went back to the beginning. He revisited the pain, revisited the fight, revisited Rocky, not for nostalgia, but for rebirth. He wrote Rocky Balboa, a story about an aging fighter stepping into the ring one last time, not to win, but to prove he still had something left. It wasn't just a movie. It was Stallone's message to the world. Don't count me out. The studios laughed. The executives rolled their eyes. No one wanted to see an old man in the ring. But Stallone believed. He always believed. Just like in 1976, when he refused to sell the script without starring in it. He fought again to make Rocky Balboa happen, and when it finally hit theaters in 2006, the response was thunderous. The underdog had returned not just on screen, but in life. The film was a surprise box office hit. Critics praised it, fans wept, and Stallone proved that true warriors never age, they evolve. But he didn't stop there. He followed up with Rambo in 2008, raw and grittier than ever. Then came The Expendables, a film that no studio believed in, but became a massive hit and sparked a new franchise. Stallone had done what few in Hollywood ever could: reinvent himself after the world moved on, not by trying to be something he wasn't, but by doubling down on who he had always been. This phase of Stallone's life wasn't just a comeback, it was a reinvention. He didn't beg to be relevant, he created relevance. He didn't ask for respect, he earned it again. And in doing so, he reminded the world that age doesn't kill greatness, complacency does. He stayed hungry, he stayed relentless, he stayed grounded in the same mentality that got him out of the bus station floor decades ago. And now, with decades of pain behind him and millions of fans still watching, he wasn't just a man, he was a movement. His story teaches a powerful truth. No matter how far you fall, you can always climb back. But the climb takes humility, it takes patience. It takes the courage to face the noise of your own doubt and the silence of your own loneliness, and most importantly, it takes belief. Stallone's greatest role wasn't Rocky, it wasn't Rambo, it wasn't any character he ever played on screen. His greatest role was being himself, the man who never quit, the man who kept fighting, the man who rose, fell, and rose again, because in the end, legends aren't remembered for how high they soared. They're remembered for how they rose after falling, for how they kept going when the world moved on. And Sylvester Stallone did just that. He didn't just survive Hollywood, he conquered it twice. Not because of luck, not because of timing, but because he never stopped believing in himself. Sylvester Stallone didn't just create movies, he created a movement, a legacy, a mindset that echoed far beyond theater screens and red carpets. What he built wasn't just cinematic history, it was a blueprint for human perseverance. Decades after Rocky first hit the screen, people still quote it in locker rooms, classrooms, and boardrooms. Why? Because the words he wrote, and the pain he lived through, resonate with every soul who's ever felt like the odds were stacked against them. Stallone's story became our story, his struggle became our strength, and his legacy is carved into culture, not with glitter, but with grit. He didn't follow trends, he didn't bow to critics, he didn't beg to be liked. He stood tall, unpolished, and real. While others shaped their careers around image and approval, Stallone shaped his around truth. That truth, his unrelenting willpower, is what turned a man with slurred speech and a crooked smile into a global icon. He taught an entire generation that success isn't about perfection, it's about persistence. That pain isn't a reason to quit, it's the fire that forges greatness. And that legacy isn't something you're given, it's something you bleed for. Through Rocky, Stallone gave the world a fighter who didn't win because he was the best, he won because he refused to stop swinging. That character became a symbol, a lighthouse for those lost in their own storms. And behind that symbol was a man who lived every word he wrote. He knew rejection, he knew poverty, he knew failure intimately. And that's why his words cut so deep. They weren't fiction. They were forged in real suffering. But his legacy didn't stop with movies. Stallone inspired movements in fitness, discipline, masculinity, and mental resilience. His training montages became viral before the internet existed. His body was built not just for film but for war against weakness. Every scene of him pushing past limits was a reflection of his actual life. He turned discipline into an art form. He made self-belief fashionable. He didn't just act like a warrior, he trained like one, lived like one, and spoke like one. And even as time passed, even as the industry changed and new faces emerged, Stallone remained relevant, not because he changed with the world, but because he stayed authentic in it. He didn't chase the moment, he became timeless by being true. In an age of overnight fame and viral noise, his long, painful climb stood out. His journey wasn't instant, it was earned, brick by brick, loss by loss, victory by bloody, unrelenting effort. He didn't just build a career, he built resilience into pop culture. He showed people they could start late, speak differently, fail publicly, be underestimated, and still rise. He redefined what it meant to be powerful, not the loudest, not the flashiest, but the most committed, the one who outlasts, the one who outworks, the one who still shows up long after everyone else quits. And through all of it, Stallone never played the victim. He never blamed anyone for his pain. He didn't complain, he created it. When he lost, he learned. When doors slammed shut, he kicked them down, and when people laughed, he wrote another scene, another line, another chapter. That's the kind of legacy that doesn't fade. It grows, it multiplies. It becomes immortal because it's built on something deeper than fame, it's built on truth. The younger generation may not know every title he starred in. They may not have seen First Blood or Cliffhanger, but they know what Rocky means. They feel what Stallone represents. And they carry that fire forward, because the story he lived reminds them that their pain is valid. Their struggle is not the end. Their rejection is not a verdict. It's the beginning of something more powerful if they choose to fight. Because in the end, what Stallone really built wasn't just entertainment. He built a legacy of relentlessness, a standard of toughness, a reminder that greatness isn't given to the most talented, it's seized by the most determined. And that's what makes his story eternal. He didn't just survive the Hollywood machine. He stared it in the face and said, "I'll do it my way," and he did. Again, and again, and again. That's what can't be broken. Not his body, not his career, but his message. His legacy lives every time someone takes a punch and keeps going. Every time someone chooses discipline over comfort. Every time someone gets laughed at and doesn't quit. Stallone gave the world more than movies, he gave it permission to fight. There comes a point in every great story where the hero doesn't just fight for himself anymore, he fights for what he represents. For Sylvester Stallone, that moment came long after the world had cheered, long after the critics had softened, and long after the box office numbers had stopped defining him. By then, he was more than a man, he was a symbol. A living reminder that the human spirit, when fully awakened, can never be broken. His face, his voice, his story, it transcended entertainment. It became eternal. Stallone's legacy doesn't live in the awards he won or the millions he earned. It lives in the fire he passed on. The fire that says, you can be broken, you can be doubted, you can be humiliated, but you can still rise. It lives in the millions of people who lace up their shoes and train harder because of Rocky. It lives in the underdog who stays in the fight one more day because they heard Stallone say, "It's not about how hard you hit, it's about how hard you can get hit and keep moving forward." That line isn't just dialogue. It's a lifestyle, a belief system, a battle cry, because the truth is, icons don't die, not when their story touches the soul of others, not when their struggle unlocks the greatness in strangers, not when their pain becomes a map for someone else's breakthrough. Sylvester Stallone may grow older, his roles may fade into the archives of film history, but his message, that lives forever. Because as long as there are people fighting battles in silence, people getting knocked down by life, people holding on to dreams, no one else sees Stallone's story will keep breathing in the background, whispering, keep going. What makes him rare isn't that he succeeded, it's how he succeeded. He never begged, he never compromised who he was. He took the hits personally, professionally, profession, he still chose to get up, again and again. He didn't rise because he was flawless, he rose because he was relentless. And that relentless spirit is what separates legends from everyone else. Stallone didn't just inspire from the screen, he inspired through example. He lived the struggle. He earned every scar, and when he stood tall, he didn't do it to say, "Look at me," he did it to say, "You can too." The beauty of Stallone's journey is that it was never about becoming a celebrity, it was about becoming a warrior. And warriors don't chase attention, they chase growth. They don't seek applause, they seek purpose. Stallone never wanted to be worshipped, he just wanted to prove it was possible. And in doing so, he gave voice to everyone who ever felt invisible. He turned rejection into redemption. He made pain powerful. He made struggle sacred. And he made perseverance beautiful. Even today, he's still working, still writing, still grinding in the gym at an age when most people are slowing down. Because for Stallone, it was never about one film, one moment, or one era. It was always about what comes next. What mountain is left to climb? What story is left to tell? What lesson is left to teach? And that's why the fire in him never dies, because it's not tied to achievement. It's tied to evolution. And that's the final lesson. You don't become great once, you become great daily. Through habits, through mindset, through showing up when you have every excuse not to. That's the Stallone code. That's what keeps his legacy alive, not just in fans, but in fighters, in dreamers, in anyone who dares to believe in something greater than their current reality. So if you're watching this and you feel overlooked, if you're grinding in silence, if you're carrying a dream no one claps for yet, let Stallone's story remind you, it's okay if they laugh now, just make them clap later. Let them doubt, let them criticize, let them walk away. That's not your concern. Your job isn't to convince them, it's to become undeniable like Stallone, like Rocky. You don't need perfection, you just need the courage to get up one more time, because one day the world will see what you've always known. And when they do, when the clapping starts, you'll realize that the struggle wasn't a setback. It was the reason you became strong. It was the reason you were chosen to carry the fire. And that fire, once lit, never dies. Icons aren't born, they're built. And Sylvester Stallone, he built himself one failure at a time, one rejection at a time, one lonely night at a time, until the world could no longer ignore him. That's the power of never giving up. That's what makes legends. That is what makes you unstoppable.